The moment someone insults what you love most, you learn exactly how much it is worth to them. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and I was 72 years old when a single sentence changed the future of my family forever. The lake house sat at the end of a winding road surrounded by pine trees and water that reflected the sky like glass. My late husband, Robert, and I bought that property 41 years earlier when our son Ryan was still a little boy. Every summer afterward seemed to leave another layer of memories inside those walls. Birthday parties, fishing trips, family dinners on the deck, rainstorms watched from the screened porch. It was never the biggest house. It was never the most expensive. But to me it held an entire lifetime. That spring Ryan, his wife Danielle, and their daughter Lily joined me for a long weekend at the lake. First everything felt normal. We unpacked groceries. Lily ran toward the dock the second we arrived. Ryan helped carry coolers inside. Danielle walked through the house looking around quietly. I noticed her expression several times, but I chose not to think much about it. On Saturday morning I woke up early and made pancakes while sunlight poured through the kitchen windows. For a few hours it felt like the old days. We laughed. We ate together. We planned a boat ride later that afternoon. Then everything changed because of one casual comment. Danielle had been exploring the upstairs hallway where old family photographs covered the walls. I heard her voice drift down the stairs. "That end of the hallway smells." A moment later she laughed lightly. "Honestly, this whole place feels old." Nobody said anything immediately. Ryan looked uncomfortable. Lily continued coloring at the table. I stood by the sink holding a coffee mug and felt something tighten inside my chest. The hallway she was talking about was not just a hallway. That was where Robert had hung every family photograph we ever treasured. Pictures from vacations, school graduations, Christmas mornings. There was even a photo taken during the final summer before he passed away. To Danielle it was an old hallway. To me it was a timeline of our lives. I forced a smile and changed the subject. Throughout the rest of the weekend, more comments followed. The furniture looked outdated. The guest rooms were small. The house needed updating. The lake community was too quiet. None of the remarks were cruel on their own. But together they felt like tiny cracks forming across something precious. That night, after everyone went to bed, I walked through the house alone. Moonlight stretched across the wooden floors. I stopped in the hallway Danielle had criticized and looked at the photographs one by one. Every frame held a story. Every picture held a memory. Standing there, I realized something difficult. I had spent years preserving this place for future generations. But maybe I was preserving it for people who no longer valued what it represented. And for the first time since Robert died, I began wondering whether holding on was really the right choice anymore. The rest of the weekend passed with a strange heaviness that only I seemed to notice. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. On the surface, everything looked perfectly normal. We spent Saturday afternoon on the lake. Lily laughed every time the boat bounced across the water. Ryan grilled hamburgers on the deck that evening. Danielle smiled in family photos and complimented the sunset. Yet every time I looked at the house, I found myself hearing her words again. "This whole place feels old." The comment followed me like an echo. On Sunday morning I woke before everyone else and stepped outside with a cup of coffee. The lake was completely still. A thin layer of mist hovered above the water. For decades this view had brought me peace. Robert used to sit beside me on the deck every morning during the summer. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we simply watched the sunrise together. Standing there alone, I realized how much of my life remained tied to this property. Every corner held a memory. Every room contained a story. When the others finally woke up, we packed for the drive home. As luggage was loaded into vehicles, Danielle stood near the front porch speaking to Ryan. She did not realize I could hear them. "I just do not understand why your mother keeps this place," she said. "The maintenance alone must cost a fortune." Ryan shrugged. "It means a lot to her." Danielle glanced back at the house. "I guess. I just think there are better ways to use money." Neither statement was cruel. That was what made them so difficult. She was not attacking me directly. She simply viewed the world differently. To her, the lake house was an expense. To me, it was part of my family's history. The drive home gave me plenty of time to think. Once I returned to my own house, the silence felt different than usual. I spent several days going through old photo albums. One afternoon, I found pictures from our first summer at the lake. Ryan was 6 years old. Robert looked younger than I remembered. We had almost no furniture back then. We could barely afford the mortgage. Yet we looked happier than people twice as wealthy. As I turned page after page, another realization slowly emerged. The people in those photographs were gone. Not physically gone, but changed. Life had moved forward. Ryan was no longer a little boy racing down the dock. Lily had her own future ahead of her. Even I was not the same woman who once spent weekends painting walls and repairing decks beside her husband. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing annual expenses connected to the property. Insurance, taxes, utilities, repairs, landscaping. The total surprised even me. For years, I never questioned it because I believed I was preserving something my family would treasure forever. Now I was not so sure. I looked out the window into the fading evening light and asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Was I holding on to the lake house because my family still needed it, or because I was afraid to let go of the past? The answer did not come immediately. But for the first time, I found myself opening my laptop and searching for local real estate agents. For 3 days, I did nothing with the list of real estate agents. The browser tab remained open on my laptop, but I could not bring myself to make a call. Every time I considered it, another memory surfaced. Ryan learning to swim near the dock. Robert teaching Lily how to cast a fishing line during her first visit. Family cookouts that lasted long after sunset. The house felt woven into the fabric of our lives. Selling it seemed impossible. Yet the question continued following me everywhere. Was I preserving a cherished family legacy, or was I carrying a responsibility nobody else wanted anymore? On Thursday afternoon, I drove to the lake alone. The trip took just under 2 hours. As familiar trees appeared along the road, I felt the same comfort I had experienced for decades. When I unlocked the front door, the scent of pine wood and old books greeted me immediately. I stood in the entryway for several minutes without moving. The house was quiet, peaceful, unchanged. I slowly walked through every room. The kitchen where countless holiday meals had been prepared. The living room where board games covered the floor during rainy weekends. The guest rooms that once seemed full every summer. Eventually, I reached the upstairs hallway. Sunlight streamed through the windows and illuminated the photographs hanging along the wall. I stopped in front of each frame. There was Ryan at age 8 holding a fish nearly as large as his arm. There was our family celebrating Robert's 50th birthday. There was Lily smiling beside her grandfather during one of his final summers. Looking at those photographs, I realized something important. The memories were not inside the house. The memories were inside us. The house had simply been the backdrop. That thought stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Before leaving, I sat on the back deck overlooking the lake. The water sparkled beneath the late-day sun. Years earlier, Robert and I used to talk about retirement there. He always wanted me to travel more, to see places beyond the lake, to enjoy life instead of spending every season maintaining property. At the time, I always laughed and said we would discuss it later. Later never came. When I returned home that evening, I opened an old file cabinet and pulled out years of financial records connected to the property. The numbers told a story I had ignored for a long time. Maintenance costs kept rising. Property taxes increased almost every year. Several major repairs would soon be necessary. I could afford them, but that was not the point. The real question was whether I wanted to spend the next decade managing a property that my family visited less and less each year. The next morning, I made a decision. Not a final decision about the house itself. Just one small step forward. I picked up the phone and called a local real estate agent named Karen Mitchell. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes. At the end of the conversation, she asked a simple question. Would you like me to come take a look at the property? I stared out my kitchen window and took a slow breath. Then I heard myself answer. Yes. I think it is time. Karen arrived at the lake house the following Tuesday. I expected the meeting to feel emotional, maybe even painful. Instead, it felt strangely practical. She walked through the property carrying a notebook and tablet while I followed behind answering questions. How old was the roof? When was the dock last repaired? Had the heating system been updated? For nearly 2 hours, We moved from room to room discussing details I had rarely considered beyond simple maintenance. Eventually, we reached the upstairs hallway. Karen paused to study the photographs covering the walls. "You have a beautiful family history here," she said. I smiled. "Most of those pictures have been hanging there for decades." She nodded thoughtfully before continuing down the hall. Unlike Danielle, she did not see an old hallway. She saw a story. By the time the tour ended, we sat together on the deck overlooking the water. Karen reviewed recent sales in the area and explained current market conditions. Then she showed me an estimated value for the property. I stared at the number longer than I expected. The lake house was worth significantly more than I imagined. Years of rising property values had transformed what Robert and I once considered a modest retirement dream into a major asset. Karen noticed my surprise. "Properties like this are becoming harder to find," she explained, "especially ones with this much shoreline." After she left, I remained on the deck for nearly an hour. The number itself was not what occupied my thoughts. What mattered was what the number represented. Possibility, freedom, options I had never seriously considered before. For years, I assumed my future would revolve around maintaining the lake house. Suddenly, another future seemed possible. A future where I traveled. A future where I spent less time managing repairs and more time enjoying life. A future Robert had encouraged me to consider long ago. Over the next several weeks, I met with Karen multiple times. We discussed timing, preparation, and what would be necessary if I decided to move forward. Yet I still told nobody. Not Ryan. Not Danielle. Not even my closest friends. The decision felt too personal. I needed time to understand it myself before explaining it to anyone else. During that period, family life continued normally. Ryan called every few days. Lily told me stories about school projects and dance practice. Danielle remained polite whenever we spoke. Nothing dramatic happened. Yet something inside me had shifted. I began noticing how rarely anyone mentioned the lake house unless plans involved using it. Nobody asked whether maintaining it had become difficult. Nobody asked how much work it required. Nobody asked whether I still wanted the responsibility. The assumption seemed to be that the house would always be there. One Sunday afternoon, I invited several friends to lunch. Most were women around my age who had experienced similar transitions after losing spouses. As we talked, I casually mentioned the possibility of selling. The reaction surprised me. Instead of shock, I received understanding. One friend had sold a family farm. Another had downsized from a large home after her children moved away. Each described the same lesson. Letting go of a place did not mean abandoning the memories connected to it. In fact, several told me they felt closer to their memories after removing the burden of maintaining old properties. Their words stayed with me. A week later, I called Karen and told her I was ready. The paperwork began immediately. Professional photographs were scheduled. Marketing materials were prepared. The listing would go live within days. That evening, I stood alone in the upstairs hallway looking at every photograph one more time. For the first time since Danielle's comment, I felt no anger. No hate. Only clarity. Because I finally understood something important. The lake house had given my family 41 beautiful years. And maybe its final gift was teaching me that holding on and moving forward are not always opposites. The listing went live on a Thursday morning. By lunchtime, Karen had already called twice. The first call informed me that several buyers wanted information. The second call informed me that 2 private showings had been scheduled for the weekend. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the phone after we ended the conversation. Part of me expected the process to move slowly. I imagined months of uncertainty and second thoughts. Instead, the market seemed to have other plans. The first weekend brought a steady stream of interested buyers. Young families, retired couples, investors looking for waterfront property. Karen handled everything professionally while keeping me informed. By Sunday evening, 3 formal offers had already arrived. I could hardly believe it. The lake house that had stood quietly at the edge of the water for more than 4 decades was suddenly attracting attention from people who saw value in it. Ironically, that realization brought me unexpected comfort. One of the offers stood out immediately. The buyers were a retired couple from another state who planned to spend their summers by the lake and their winters traveling. They spoke about creating memories with grandchildren. They spoke about family gatherings and holiday traditions. Listening to Karen describe them, I found myself smiling. They sounded remarkably similar to Robert and me all those years ago. Meanwhile, nobody in my family knew what was happening. Not because I was hiding it out of spite. I simply wanted certainty before having a difficult conversation. There was no reason to create unnecessary drama, while everything remained uncertain. Then, on Tuesday afternoon, certainty arrived. The retired couple submitted an improved offer significantly above the asking price. After reviewing the details with Karen and my attorney, I accepted. Just like that, the process moved from possibility to reality. The house was officially under contract. That evening, I sat on my back porch and watched the sunset. Instead of sadness, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For months, perhaps years, I had been carrying a responsibility I no longer truly wanted. Now, for the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. The following morning, I called Ryan. "I need to tell you something," I said. My voice remained calm. "I sold the lake house." Silence immediately followed. Not the kind of silence created by a poor phone connection. The kind created by genuine shock. "You what?" he finally asked. I repeated myself. Several more seconds passed before he spoke again. "Mom, are you serious?" "Yes." He sounded completely stunned. "When did this happen?" I explained the timeline. The meetings. The listing. The offer. The accepted contract. Ryan listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "Why did not you tell us?" I looked out toward the fading afternoon light and answered honestly. Because I needed to make the decision for myself before anyone tried to make it for me. Ryan did not argue. In fact, he sounded thoughtful. But before our conversation ended, he said something that immediately caught my attention. "Mom, Danielle is not going to take this well." I thanked him for his honesty. Then we ended the call. Less than 30 minutes later, my phone lit up with Danielle's name. And somehow, before I even answered, I had a feeling that this conversation would be very different from all the others. When I answered Danielle's call, I expected anger. Instead, I heard disbelief. "You sold it?" she asked immediately. There was no greeting. No small talk. Just the question. "Yes," I replied calmly. "The contract has been signed." Silence followed. Then came another question. "Why would you do that?" I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. It was interesting how differently people viewed the same decision. To me, it had become a thoughtful transition after months of reflection. To Danielle, it seemed sudden and impossible. "Because it was the right time," I answered. "The house no longer fits the life I want moving forward." Danielle sounded frustrated. "But that house has always been in the family." I nodded even though she could not see me. "It was in the family because I owned it. And now I have chosen a different path." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then something unexpected happened. The conversation shifted away from the sale itself. Danielle began talking about Lily, about summers at the lake, about traditions she assumed would continue forever. I listened carefully. The more she spoke, the more I realized something important. She was not upset about the value of the property. She was upset about losing access to a future she had quietly imagined. Family barbecues. Long weekends, future vacations, memories that had not happened yet. The irony was impossible to ignore. Weeks earlier, she viewed the house as outdated and impractical. Now she spoke about it as though it were irreplaceable. After we ended the call, I spent the evening thinking about our conversation. For the first time, I began seeing Danielle differently. Perhaps she had never truly understood what the lake house meant until she faced the possibility of losing it. Sometimes people only recognize value when permanence disappears. A few days later, Ryan stopped by my house. He looked exhausted. Not angry. Just thoughtful. We sat on the back patio while the late afternoon sun settled across the yard. Eventually, he sighed and shook his head. "I think this caught everyone off guard." I smiled gently. "Including me." That answer surprised him. So I explained everything. The loneliness that followed Robert's passing, the increasing maintenance, the rising costs, the realization that I was preserving a property more than I was enjoying it. Ryan listened quietly. When I finished, he stared toward the garden for several seconds. "I wish I had asked more questions," he admitted. About the house. About what you wanted. Hearing those words touched me deeply, not because I needed an apology, but because he finally understood that the decision had never been about real estate. It had been about my life, my future, my freedom to choose what came next. Before leaving, Ryan handed me a small photo album he had found while cleaning his office. Inside were pictures from dozens of lake house summers, some I had not seen in years. One photograph stopped me completely. It showed Robert standing on the dock with his arm around me. We were both laughing at something outside the frame. Written beneath the picture in his handwriting were 6 simple words. Do not forget to keep living. I stared at those words long after Ryan left, and for the first time since accepting the offer, I felt absolutely certain that Robert would have supported my decision. What I did not know was that within the next week, another opportunity would appear. One that would completely change how I imagined the next chapter of my life. The opportunity arrived on a rainy Wednesday morning through a conversation I almost canceled. My friend Patricia invited me to lunch at a small waterfront restaurant about an hour from my home. Normally I would have declined because I had paperwork related to the lake house closing scattered across my dining room table. But something told me to go. During lunch, Patricia told me about a new coastal condominium community she had recently visited. The development sat along a quiet stretch of shoreline overlooking the ocean. Residents could walk to local shops, restaurants, and parks. There was no lawn maintenance, no creepers, no property management headaches, just simple living and beautiful views. At first I listened politely without giving it much thought. Then Patricia showed me several photographs on her phone. The moment I saw the images, something inside me shifted. Large windows overlooked the water. Walking paths followed the coastline. Small cafes sat within easy walking distance. For the first time in years, I found myself imagining a completely different future. Later that afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I drove to the community and scheduled a tour. The sales representative greeted me warmly and showed me several available units. One in particular immediately captured my attention. It was not the largest. It was not the most expensive, but the view was extraordinary. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Sunlight danced across the water exactly the way it danced across the lake each morning. Yet everything felt fresh and new. I stood there silently for several moments. The representative continued talking about amenities and floor plans, but I barely heard her. Instead, I found myself thinking about Robert. Years ago, he often talked about traveling the coast after retirement. He loved the water in all its forms. Lakes, rivers, oceans. Looking out those windows, I could almost hear him encouraging me to stop postponing life. That evening, I returned home carrying brochures and information packets. I spread them across the kitchen table beside the paperwork from the lake house sale. The contrast was striking. One stack represented 41 years of memories. The other represented possibilities I had never seriously considered. Over the next several days, I returned twice more. Each visit strengthened my certainty. The community felt welcoming. The pace felt comfortable. Most importantly, I felt excited. I had not experienced genuine excitement about the future in a very long time. Eventually, I made my decision. A portion of the proceeds from the lake house would purchase the oceanfront condominium outright. No mortgage. No financial stress. Just a new chapter. The contract was signed less than 2 weeks later. For the first time since Robert passed away, I felt as though I was building something instead of preserving something. When Ryan learned about the purchase, he sounded surprised but supportive. Danielle's reaction was harder to read. She asked several questions about the location and timing, but her voice carried a thoughtful quality that had not been there before. Then, near the end of our conversation, she asked one simple question. Can we visit before you move in? The request caught me off guard. And somehow, I sensed that the answer to that question would determine far more than where I planned to live next. I agreed to the visit without hesitation. Of course, I told Danielle. You are family. Yet after ending the call, I found myself wondering why she suddenly seemed interested. For weeks, our conversations had revolved around the lake house and the decision to sell it. Now her attention appeared focused on the future rather than the past. A few days later, Ryan, Danielle, and Lily joined me for a tour of the condominium community. The weather could not have been more beautiful. Bright sunlight reflected off the ocean, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of salt water through the air. As we walked along the waterfront paths, Lily raced ahead excitedly, stopping every few minutes to point at seabirds or boats in the distance. Watching her reminded me of Ryan running along the docks at the lake when he was her age. Some things never change. When we entered the condominium, I paid close attention to everyone's reactions. Ryan immediately moved toward the windows overlooking the ocean. He stood there quietly for several moments before smiling. "Mom, this view is incredible." I laughed. That was my reaction too. Lily loved everything. The elevators, the walking path, the nearby ice cream shop, the beach access. To a child, every new place feels like an adventure. Danielle remained quieter. She walked through each room slowly, studying details. Occasionally she asked practical questions about the building and community, but her expression was thoughtful rather than critical. Eventually, we stepped onto the balcony overlooking the water. The ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. For a few moments nobody spoke. Then Danielle surprised me. "I understand it now," she said softly. I turned toward her. "Understand what?" She looked out at the water before answering. "Why you sold the house." The honesty in her voice immediately caught my attention. Danielle took a slow breath. I think I was looking at everything from the wrong perspective. Nobody interrupted. She continued speaking. "I kept thinking about the property itself, the maintenance, the costs, the building. I never stopped to think about what you wanted." The admission hung in the air between us. I could tell the words were not easy for her. For the first time since this entire situation began, she seemed to fully understand that the lake house had never been just real estate. It had represented decades of memories, responsibilities, and sacrifices. More importantly, selling it represented my decision to choose a different future. Ryan placed a hand on her shoulder. Neither said anything further. They did not need to. Sometimes understanding arrives quietly. Later that afternoon, we shared lunch at a restaurant overlooking the marina. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in months. Conversation flowed naturally. Nobody discussed property values or contracts. Instead, we talked about upcoming vacations, Lily's school year, and future family gatherings. For the first time in a long while, the future felt exciting instead of uncertain. As lunch ended, Danielle surprised me again. She reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "I am sorry," she said, "for not seeing things more clearly sooner." I smiled and squeezed her hand back. No speeches were necessary. No dramatic reconciliation was required. Sometimes healing begins with a simple acknowledgement. As we drove home that evening, I felt something I had not experienced since Robert passed away. A sense that life was moving forward exactly as it should. What none of us realized was that one final visit to the lake house remained ahead of us. And that visit would change how all of us remembered the place forever. 2 weeks before the closing date, I made one final trip to the lake house. This time I invited Ryan, Danielle, and Lily to join me. I told them I wanted one last family weekend before ownership officially changed hands. Everyone agreed immediately. When we arrived on Friday evening, the atmosphere felt different from every visit before. Nobody was focused on maintenance issues, future plans, or property values. Instead, everyone seemed determined to enjoy the time we had left there. The lake greeted us with calm water and clear skies. Lily rushed toward the dock just as she always had. Ryan carried luggage inside while Danielle helped unpack groceries. For a moment it felt like stepping backward through time. On Saturday morning, I suggested something unusual. I brought several empty boxes into the upstairs hallway and asked everyone to help remove the framed photographs from the walls. First nobody spoke. Then Ryan smiled softly. "Probably time to bring these home." One by one, we carefully lifted the pictures down. As each frame came off the wall, another memory surfaced. We laughed about old hairstyles. We pointed out clothing trends that should have remained in the past. Lily asked questions about relatives she had never met. Even Danielle became completely absorbed in the stories behind the photographs. Eventually, we reached the picture that always stopped me. The photograph of Robert and me standing together on the dock many years earlier. Danielle studied it for a long moment. You both look so happy, she said quietly. We were, I replied. And that is exactly why I never wanted this house to become a burden. It was built from happy memories, not obligations. She nodded thoughtfully. Later that afternoon, we gathered on the deck overlooking the lake. The conversation drifted naturally toward family traditions. Ryan admitted he had always assumed the house would remain in the family forever. Danielle admitted she had never truly understood how much responsibility came with ownership. Neither statement carried guilt anymore, only perspective. As the sun began setting, Lily asked a question that surprised all of us. If someone else owns the house, do the memories disappear? The adults exchanged glances. Then I smiled and invited her to sit beside me. No, sweetheart, I said gently. Memories do not live inside buildings. They live inside people. She considered that for a moment before nodding. So we still keep them? Always. That simple exchange seemed to capture everything I had spent months trying to understand myself. The next morning before leaving, we walked through the house one final time. Each room felt familiar yet somehow lighter. There was no sadness. No regret. Only gratitude. At the front door, Danielle paused and looked back down the upstairs hallway. The same hallway that had unintentionally started this entire journey. Then she turned toward me. Thank you for bringing us here one last time. I smiled warmly. Thank you for coming. As we drove away, the lake house slowly disappeared behind the trees. 41 years of family history remained there, yet somehow none of it felt lost. Because what mattered most was not the property we were leaving behind. What mattered was the understanding we were carrying forward. And when closing day finally arrived a few days later, I signed the final documents with complete peace in my heart, knowing that the best chapter of my life might still be waiting ahead.